A few years ago, I found this BRNO 803, also known as the CZ Stopper in some markets, on sale, and it was such a good price I couldn't pass it up, and I'd always wanted a double barrel rifle. This double barrel rifle has two triggers, and it is in 9.3 by 74. An older cartridge, a German one, that's a lot of fun to shoot and good for elk, good for moose, and good for an awful lot of other things. At over 3.5 inches long, it's a little bit like a pencil, the cartridge, but when you get an over and under rifle for a reasonable price and you've got an old cartridge like the 9.3 by 74, too hard to pass up. One of the challenges with double-barreled rifles is getting the barrels to hit pretty close to the same spot. These are not meant generally as high-precision firearms that you'd get in a 338 Lapua or 7mm Remington Magnum or any number of other things that people might call tack drivers. Generally speaking, double-barrel rifles were made to hunt dangerous game in Africa and other places where you needed to fire two quick shots, often in 458 Win Mag, 416 Rifby, 375 H&H, and a number of those famous dangerous game calibers. Again, this one happens to be a 9.3 by 74. The process of getting the barrels to hit in the same place is called regulating. I tried it myself for the first time the other day, got half-decent results. I think the first thing that I would say is if you're getting half-decent results out of a double-barrel rifle that you picked up cheap or secondhand or something like that, is just stick with it. It is tricky, and if you get it wrong, it gets very wrong very quickly, and it can be a bit of a pain to get back to where you want it to be. So only do it if you're not satisfied at all with what's there. If you're landing at 50 meters, 2 inches apart or something like that, that's generally speaking pretty good for a rifle that you spend under $5,000 for. If you're going to spend $140,000 for some of the others, you probably want to complain a bit more. But for what I paid for this, a couple of inches at 50 meters between the two barrels, given the type of gun that it is and what I use it for, isn't bad. One of the things to note is that you can only regulate these barrels for a particular bullet and charge. Every single different bullet, every single different charge you have will the bullets in different distances from each other. And so you want to be using a consistent charge and a consistent bullet for all of your shooting in that rifle, unless you absolutely have to change for some reason, and then you're going to have to check out to see what the regulation is, meaning the spread between the two impact points for the two different barrels. And you also have to remember that the distance between where they hit will change over distance, because as any two lines divide, the further they go along, the further they get apart from each other. The process of regulating the barrels is a little finicky, but it isn't especially complicated. You're best to use a lead sled or something like that. These are generally heavy caliber rifles, so they do kick a fair bit, and you want to reduce as many variables as you possibly can when sighting in. You'll want a spotting scope. You'll need to have a fine Allen key wrench or hex wrench. There's a hex bit there. You'll be able to figure out which one fits your rifle. I think they're the same for all of the BRNO 803s. And you'll need a 100-meter target. And what I do is I put tape, green masking tape, when I'm at the range, just to help me identify the left, right, top, bottom for purposes of ease of recognition. Now, when you're doing this, you have to understand with a double barrel rifle that the points of impact will differ for each charge and each bullet that you use. And so you're best to use the same charge and same bullet all the time in order to be as confident as possible about where they're landing. Now, what I'm measuring here are not individual shots. I'm measuring pairs. So you can see that is 6 top and that is 6 bottom. The front trigger obviously pulls bottom. The back trigger pulls top. You can see the horizontal isn't that far off there, but the vertical is quite substantial. Earlier shots, you can see 2 bottom, 2 top, a little closer together on the vertical and a little closer together on the horizontal as well. If you look, well, for example, at one bottom and it being about there, one top went off the top of the page and hit the wood up there. And so again, what you should take from that is that you are looking at each shot as part of the pair that you're shooting, and the idea is to bring them as close as you can together. I moved to 50 meters just to make things a little simpler. Now, this is where things started to come together fairly nicely. If you look at, for example, 3 top and 3 bottom, that's a little far off, almost 7 inches. Didn't learn anything in the next shot, 4 bottom and 4 top, which is almost 14 inches apart as well. But then you can see here's 5 top and 5 bottom. They're approximately 4 inches off on the horizontal and another 4 inches on the vertical. But then 6 top and 6 bottom are coming closer together. You can see 7 bottom and 7 top have hit pretty much the same vertical. If there's an error there, it's probably the shooter rather than the aim points. And then I get to within 2 inches here. These are half-inch increments rather than 1-inch increments on the graph, even though the target was 1-inch increments. And I've got perfect alignment on vertical and not that far off. If I were aiming for the center point and hit 1 inch right of the heart or 1 inch left of the heart at 50 meters for the type of game that I'm shooting at, it wouldn't make much of a difference at all with a 270 grain bullet. So this is what you're doing. You're measuring your pairs. It's important that you track each shot. You want to know where the top barrel's going. You want to know where the bottom barrel's going, and you know what the group is. Very straightforward for me with the red dot to now move that to the bullseye now that I know what the pairs are doing. But this is not something you do with a small number of cartridges. I think I used about 40. It's not something that you want to do from memory. You want to write it down and you want to know exactly where each shot has gone and what the impact is of your moves. If you look quickly at number 4, which is a 14-inch difference on the horizontal, I would suspect that's approximately 3 to 4 millimeters movement of the gun barrel, if that. And so it's very fine adjustments that you're making in order to get even that big a set of moves. I've put the firearm on its side and I've removed the forestock, which you need to do in order to do the vertical adjustment. There are 2 screws at the end. You can see this side here, and there is an identical one on the other side. One of the things that surprised me was that the barrels are not perfectly aligned as you look at them at this point in time. In fact, as you can see here, there's quite a gap. That at first I thought was perhaps a mistake, and perhaps why when I was shooting things I had a couple of inches of separation in the impact points of the barrel. What you do is you loosen this screw and you loosen the screw underneath. And when you do that, you physically push the barrel in one direction or the other. The shots that went off the page were probably moved half the width of the gap that you see in the piece that's protruding there. You have to move it only slightly in order to get quite considerable changes, even at 50 yards. And if you're at 100, it will be quite substantial. So the adjustments that you're making are micro adjustments. If you go to this point, you can see the hex bolt that's in there, and that just slides forward and slides backwards. You only need to adjust it a tiny bit. It is interesting that it isn't linear, in that you don't just move it sort of consistently and find that it gets further and further together and stays in that direction, or closer and closer to each other and stays in that direction. There seems to be a sweet spot on this barrel where it has been further apart and suddenly comes much closer. You're going to have to just keep experimenting with it. I ended up shooting about 40 rounds yesterday to get to where I ended up. That's probably just because it's my first time, but it's not something you're likely to be able to accomplish on a small number of tries. So what you're doing with this is you're loosening that bolt and then just sliding it forward or backwards and then tightening it up quite considerably. You obviously want the forearm on it when you're shooting it, so you're constantly taking the forearm off or the forestock off and putting it back on just to make sure that you're holding it the way you would be holding it when you're shooting. But these are the two pieces. This is for the vertical, and again, you just loosen that, slide it forwards or backwards a bit, and for these, you end up loosening the two small bolts on both sides. Be very careful. Those will fall out. There is a steel rod that you can see right there that is between, that it abuts against, but it's in abutting against that rod from both sides at the same time that it holds it in place. And so you want to make sure that it's quite tightly in there in order to make sure that they don't fall out. Because if those go, then you will have absolutely no idea where your rifle is shooting. So I am not an expert in the matter, but it did end up working for me. I hadn't seen any other instructions for how to do this other than in the guide. And so that is the way that I did it. The paper is important. The spotting scope is important. A large number of cartridges is important. A lot of patience and experimentation. So if you've got one of these great guns, good luck and happy regulation.